Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Catherine Ellis. I'm the Deputy Lead of the Wellbeing in Ageing team, which was for a lot of years called the Academic Unit for Psychiatry of Old Age from the University of Melbourne Department of Psychiatry. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today as you're all entering in to hear on a topic that is really, I think, very close to many of our hearts and going to be really interesting to hear about today. Before we get into the symposium itself, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting today. For me, it's the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay respects to our elders past, present and emerging. Firstly, a little housekeeping. We'll be able to have a little bit of time for question and answer after the presentation today. So we'll be asking people just to use the Q&A button up the top. The chat is actually disabled, so it's much easier for us to see the Q&A up the top. That will be closed for some time, but please do use it as we get towards the end of the session. Alternatively, feel free to use that hand up button or put your hand up, which brings us the attention to you in the question time, and we'll be able to unmute you and hear from you and hear from Lydia. So without further ado, let's introduce Lydia. Really excited to have Dr. Lydia Brown with us today. She's a senior lecturer in the School of Psychological Sciences and a member of the Brain and Mental Health Research Hub. After receiving her PhD on self-compassion and menopause in 2015, Lydia completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School and the University of Melbourne on healthy ageing. Her research focuses on understanding and enhancing well-being during the menopause transition and in the second half of life more generally. Alongside research, Lydia has worked as a clinical psychologist for a number of years, supporting adults to manage mental health and conditions such as depression, anxiety, and recovery from trauma. She teaches primarily into the postgraduate program at the University of Melbourne and is helping to train the next generation of psychologists in using clinical skills. And Lydia is going to be speaking to us today on promoting good mental health over menopause and beyond. So welcome, Lydia. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the warm welcome, and I really look forward to sharing the next hour or so, perhaps 40 minutes of presentation, and then time for questions at the end. Really delighted to be here and talk about topics that are very close to my heart. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Is that looking good for everybody? I assume it is.
Yeah, that looks good.
Excellent. So promoting good health over menopause and beyond. And just to give you a bit of a flavour for my two areas of interest. So on the one hand, I'm very interested in research quality and synthesising data to understand where the evidence stands with the intention and with the interest in translating evidence into clinical practice, be that in my field of clinical psychology or more generally in medicine. Also, as a clinical psychologist, I believe we have some of the longest treatment sessions of all the health professions, perhaps alongside psychiatry. We sit down with people and we have a long time listening to people and their lived experience. And part of my research is sort of from the bottom up, coming from what I hear when I speak with clients, in this case, midlife women transitioning through menopause, older adults. And so it can get a bit personal and a bit sort of bringing in that clinical psychology part of my brain. So we'll be going from sort of evidence and data into the kind of the heart or the heart of clinical practice. So hopefully we can integrate those two slightly different sides of myself and my research and work. Okay, so we'll just move on. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. This is unceded land, and I do pay my respects to the elders past and present. Also to acknowledge that I use women often in my language when talking about menopause. Menopause happens to all people with typically functioning ovaries. And this includes some transgender men and other gender diverse people. A lot of the research, and nearly all of the research, is on women and hasn't accounted or looked so much at those other groups, and more work in this area is also needed. So I'm going to explore four areas with you today, starting with a bit of an introduction to menopause and some key terms, and relating it back to healthy aging. So just to contextualize what we're talking about. Then I'll dive into my key research around menopause and mental health. So I was the lead author of one paper on the Lancet series, and that was the paper on menopause and mental health. So I'll talk you through that process, our findings, and also the process of being involved in that series. And then we'll be shifting gears to look more at self-compassion. This is where the bottom-up clinical psychology or therapist side of me comes out. And then we'll finish by looking at policy and practice implications of some of this work. So why does menopause and midlife mental health matter? Well, by 2030, 500 million women will be aged 45 to 55 globally. And this is the typical time when women transition from being premenopausal with regular menstrual cycles to postmenopausal. And this is the time when those menopausal symptoms can be at their height. So it's a very large chunk of society. And there is an enormous personal and economic cost of menopause. So most women do experience physical symptoms or, challenging symptoms, and we'll talk more about that. And their psychological symptoms are common. And economically, there can be an absolute burden. So women may leave the workforce or reduce their work capacity over the menopause years at times. A study out of Stanford this year talks about the menopause penalty, where women who are seeking help for the menopause, which means that they do have those impactful symptoms, they on average go on to earn 10% less 4 years later than those who don't. So menopause is a very significant health issue that has real costs, but it has been a very neglected area of medicine and of research. So I experienced this firsthand. I was very interested in the area and was fortunate enough to have Associate Professor Christina Bryant working in my department and available to be a PhD supervisor in the field of menopause and mental health, alongside Fiona Judd from the Women's Hospital. And they had this interest in menopause, but it was going against the grain. Menopause was sort of seen as a bit of a niche topic. And while I focused my PhD on menopause and self-compassion, I struggled to kind of pursue a research career just in that area. And I did branch out to diabetes, dementia, healthy aging more generally. I'm grateful for that opportunity to expand. But there just wasn't the research backing and clinical support for menopause researchers back sort of even as recently as 2015. That's when I graduated from the combined PhD clinical program. So there's been a massive shift. Menopause is in the spotlight now. The Senate inquiry into menopause happened in Australia last year, acknowledging that this has been a neglected area. And this new focus in society and research is overdue. It's really welcome. But also it can cause its own problems, because when we have to counterbalance foundations that have been neglected, the big spotlight on that history can also cause problems. And we'll talk about that as we go along. But nonetheless, the spotlight is overdue and 100% welcome. So midlife and mental health absolutely do matter. And just to contextualize the space, I'm talking about menopause in more detail, but menopause never happens in a vacuum. And this is what you hear when you speak clinically with midlife women. Menopause is absolutely part of their experience, but also it tends to happen in midlife, where it's a busy phase of life. You're often juggling significant demands. You may have grown in seniority at work. You may be a boss or have a team. You may have challenges at work, or you also might have growing children, perhaps teenagers, or you might have young children if you've had children late, alongside aging parents that might require new care needs, and women bear the grunt of those care needs. So you're juggling a lot in your life. You may have role transitions, you may get divorced, or you may be recalibrating your relationship as your children grow older and don't need you as much for those basic demands. So it's a really significant time in the life stage. And Carl Jung, I'm not a Jungian therapist, but he talks about midlife as being this turning point. In the first half of life, you're accumulating things in the world. You may be getting a mortgage or starting a family, and there's sort of this outwards focus of expansion. At midlife, you may have your family, or if you didn't have children, you're coming to terms with not having children. You may already have a house, or you may be sort of established with that. And so you don't need to kind of accumulate in the same way that it's typical to earlier in life. And with this, it comes as sometimes a natural leaning inwards and thinking, well, what really matters to me? How do I want to spend the second half of my life? Who am I outside of my roles? So there's this really interesting shift that can happen internally alongside the busy responsibilities. So menopause, going into today's topic that kind of interplays with these broader issues. I like this image because it shows a sense of sort of gaining wisdom and growth. Premenopause is on the right, but you can see as we grow, we accumulate knowledge and wisdom. We do become better versions of ourselves in many ways. And you can sort of see that. So premenopause is when your menstrual cycles, if you have functioning ovaries, are typically sort of more regular. Perimenopause is when you start to see inconsistencies or changes in your menstrual cycles. So when those changes last about 7 days of inconsistency, then you can be said to be in perimenopause. And perimenopause is that time of irregular menstrual cycles, and this is caused by ovarian aging, culminating in the cessation of your menstrual period, which is menopause. So we never know which will be our final menstrual period. So that's why menopause has to be defined retrospectively. So after a year of not having menstrual cycles, then you can be determined to be postmenopause. So the perimenopause is on average lasts about 4 years, but there's a lot of variance. On average could start around age 47. Again, there's variance, but just to give you a sort of context of where this sits. So on average, last 4 years, so that means the average age of menopause is around 51. So symptoms of menopause, though, actually expand beyond just the perimenopause. So symptoms tend to start in perimenopause, although new data shows that it could even be earlier than that sometimes. But symptoms start in the perimenopause, but they're actually at their peak in the early postmenopause. So in those when you're in your early 50s, menstrual cycles have stopped. So this is part of the infographic linked to the Lancet series on menopause, and this shows some of the core symptoms of menopause. So hot flushes and night sweats are really the hallmark symptoms. So these are these sort of transient surges in body temperature, often radiating from the chest up through the face. They can happen during the day, or often really troublesome and uncomfortable when they happen at night and disturb your sleep. So these can occur for sort of up to 80% of midlife women. So hot flushes are common, and they can last, up to the 7 or 10 or sometimes longer, even up to 20 years. So hot flushes are, a significant symptom. Sleep disturbance, joint pain and stiffness, vaginal dryness, heavy or prolonged bleeding. So these symptoms are caused to the hormonal changes underlying the ovarian aging of the menopause transition. So fluctuating and then declining estrogen levels, as well as changing and declining progesterone as well. So effective treatments are available as well. So you may have heard of much a wider range of symptoms than just these core symptoms of menopause. And we know that estrogen has wide-reaching effects on the body, and women certainly report, a wide range of symptoms. So the list isn't really necessarily evidence-based. It can't be sort of linked back to key sort of evidence, but women do certainly report, and there are very significant and wider symptoms associated with menopause. But the core symptoms are the ones with stronger evidence behind them, showing that sort of consistency. So hot flushes we've spoken about, and I know it's perhaps not common to show a little video in a research seminar, but Imogen Crump, we'll see if this will work. Hopefully it won't show me an ad. It might. Oh, there we go. See if I can get this. So she's a colleague from Melbourne University in engagement, and she gave me permission to share this. But this is, here you can see a hot flush here. So it is silent at the beginning. You'll hear the sound in a moment, well, you should. Let me know if you can't, but it's, here we go.
We're not getting the audio, Lydia.
Okay. You might have to watch that then in your own time if you can't hear the audio, although you can see a little bit from the, just from the video clip. Essentially, Imogen Crump is having a huge hot flush on live TV. It's hugely distracting, impacts her concentration and train of thought. But what I like about this example of hot flush, which I think did go quite viral, is it shows the significant burden and impact, but also that we don't really have to have shame about this or embarrassment. It's impactful, but a hot flush can have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It might impact our concentration and be really unpleasant in the thick of it. But when we talk about it, when we can feel safe to be able to share our experience with those around us, this really helps. And this has not always been the case. So just yesterday, I was hearing a woman talk about how embarrassed she felt about having hot flushes at work. And it's unacceptable. It just shows how women really have endured a really huge amount of unnecessary suffering when it comes to menopause, because it's essentially the place where misogyny and ageism collide. And women are changing that dialogue now, but there's this unfortunate history where we've had to endure, a bit of discomfort and a lot, really, when it comes to menopause and hot flushes. And this absolutely matters. So we know that attitudes towards both menopause and aging are very central to women's experience. So longitudinal data shows that women's attitude towards menopause and aging at baseline does predict the severity of future symptoms. So I'm not saying that hot flushes are sort of somehow all to do with your attitude. Of course they're not. They're a physiological experience. After I had my children postnatally, it's another time where you can have hot flushes, and they're awful. They're worse than I would have ever thought. As a hot flush researcher, the lived experience was far worse than I could have ever thought. But our attitude towards menopause and aging are also important. And I'll come back to attitudes towards aging perhaps towards the end, depending on time. But we know that attitudes towards aging are very powerful predictors of our future health. So the seminal study by Levy of about 660 people found that those with a positive attitude to aging lived up to 7 years longer than those holding a negative view of aging, with measurements up to about 23 years attitudes to aging measured prior, so 23 years prior. So it's a really important area. But again, Karen is an example of how our society doesn't always help us to feel good about aging, especially if we're a woman. So this is just ChatGPT showing me a quintessential Karen, and that's not the future that I want to have for myself. And I also love the name Karen, but it's an example how there are these sort of stereotypes that can really infiltrate into our psyche and that can impact us and lead us to have potentially more negative views of aging and menopause. So menopause is a sex-specific formative time for healthy aging. It's that time of life when we are setting up health behaviours that will shape the course of the second half of our life, exactly at the time of menopause. It's an opportunity for women and those with ovaries to prioritise their health, prioritise their physical health. There are physical changes associated with menopause, like bone density can reduce, which means that we really need to kind of invest in our strength building. And so it's a time to really invest in our health, physical and mental and social, and even reevaluate what is meaningful to us. And this, in turn, can set the course for healthy aging in the years ahead. So focusing in on menopause and mental health now. So this is a project I was involved with that was published last year, looking at reviewing what we know about menopause and mental health for the Lancet. So at baseline, what we do know, what's sort of established, is that psychological symptoms are typically included in menopause symptom scales. So if you look at say, the menopause rating scale or green climacteric scale, which measures menopausal symptoms, there's typically a subscale looking at mental health. So items like depression, anxiety, irritability, more sort of unusual ones like rage or paranoid thinking even. So we know that sort of this has been established since the 1950s, that menopause and mental health are interlinked. However, at the same time, and North American menopause guidelines for managing perimenopausal depression report that the prevalence of depressive symptoms is up to 68%, which is really high. I'll come back to that figure, though, in a moment. But again, there's a sort of flavour of quite poor quality research. So we do have some sort of longitudinal studies, but not that many. And at the time of writing this review, all the longitudinal data on menopause and mental health had not been synthesized in a systematic review. So that was really a key focus of our paper, was to hone in on high quality evidence, so looking at prospective studies where we can track mental health changes over time from when women are before the menopause transition, so premenopausal, looking at their mental health as they transition through perimenopause and into postmenopause. By the way, perimenopause can also be called the menopause transition. It's overlapping, quite similar term. We can talk about the differences later if you'd like, but menopause transition and perimenopause are essentially interchangeable. So we conducted a scoping review looking widely at menopause and mental health. And this is sort of often the idea for a Lancet series, is that you've got this wide scope and you're providing a broad update to communicate information with clinicians around the world. So that's why we had this wider scope, looking at different mental health outcomes. And we're also sort of communicating recommendations for clinicians as well within this project. So we had a multidisciplinary team of experts in menopause and mental health from around the world involved with this study. And we focused in on those prospective or higher quality evidence. So let's go into the findings. So major depressive disorder. Do women going through menopause, are they at greater risk of major depressive disorder? Well, looking at prospective studies, so that high quality of evidence, there's not a lot of evidence because major depressive disorder is quite expensive to measure in a clinical setting or in population-based research, because it does really require a clinician or a structured interview to assess. So there's one study, the SWAN study from the US, shows that perimenopause may be associated with an increased risk of recurrence of major depressive disorder for those with a personal history, but not new onset according to their kind of most recent data wave. So recurrence but not new onset. Depressive symptoms, it's a bit more of a mixed picture. So findings from 12 prospective studies showed that were essentially mixed, and there was no sort of strong evidence of a really high rise in the prevalence of depressive symptoms across these studies. So in the studies that we included, the prevalence of depressive symptoms during perimenopause, that transition state that may be associated with the increased risk. So prevalence of depressive symptoms was between 16.5 and 27.8%. Compared to before the menopause, prevalence ranged of between 14.3 and 20.9%. So there is an increased risk during the perimenopause transition, a small increased risk, but the prevalence does not go through the roof. And I got very confused by this finding because I wondered, well, what about the North American Menopause Society guidelines? They report the 68%, and that figure is often used in grant applications. It really sort of helps to shine a spotlight on the area. Researchers like to be able to communicate a very significant problem because then it can also attract sort of funding for research. So is the 68% right, or is that more mild increase right? So it seems like the earlier prevalence was a calculation error, and I can go through the details of that if we wanted. So quite an interesting kind of a head shift in what we know about menopause, especially that perimenopause transition and risk of depressive symptoms. So in Australia, ABS data, just going back to major depressive disorder, here we've got the affective disorders, which includes depression, so disorders rather than symptoms. And around the time of menopause, so in your late 40s, early 50s, according to the ABS data, it's males tend to have that kind of increased risk, but we don't see this big increased risk of depressive disorders for women around that time of menopause. So this isn't sort of defining evidence, but it just shows that menopause isn't universally associated with a very, very high increased risk of major depressive disorder. So the NAMS guidelines, where they talk about the 68%, going into the paper that supposedly links to the 68%, the table, if you kind of actually calculate the prevalence of depressive symptoms in the table, I think they might have read the 68 straight one way. We can go back to the slide if you want, but from my reading and the calculation, the symptom prevalence in perimenopause is 28%. Compared to 20% before menopause. And it's interesting parallel to what we found overall for those prospective studies of prevalence being a little bit increased, but not dramatically increased. And I think this is a good news story for women approaching menopause, to know that depressive symptoms sort of could be part of it, but it's not inevitable or universal. There's also sort of a bit of lack of clarity when it comes to talking about study findings in terms of absolute risk versus sort of odds ratios. So one of the studies we included reported a quadrupled risk of new onset depressive disorder. Depressive symptoms over the menopause, and we included that in our review. But when you look at the kind of the prevalence So the actual proportion of women in the sample from the study experiencing depressive symptoms, you can see time around menopause is 0. So on average, perimenopause lasts 4 years, and before the menopause is sort of, in the earlier years. So we don't see the sort of skyrocketing rate in the prevalence of depressive symptoms in the years leading up to the menopause. So we actually got permission to include this in our Lancet paper to just show that, well, yes, there's a quadruple increased risk, but you can't actually see it in terms of prevalence of depressive symptoms. So it's just about how sort of statistics work. And that's sort of important to kind of understand findings and perspective. So all of that said, though, menopause can absolutely and does impact our mental health. So it can impact it in a more transient way than how clinical psychologists would understand depression, which is typically more enduring, or even symptoms are typically measured over the past week. Your hormone changes might create more transient impacts on mood that aren't necessarily captured in that kind of week-long review of your depressive symptoms, for example. But also there are menopause-related risk factors. So if you've had surgical menopause, you may be at greater risk of experiencing depressive symptoms. If you have really severe hot flushes, and unfortunately, GPs in Australia and around the world have not always been trained very well to treat hot flushes. So you might have unnecessarily had to endure not just the hot flushes, but then the interrupted sleep because of them and the sequelae of impacted mood, all unnecessarily because it's been that neglected area or because clinicians haven't felt competent to manage these symptoms. So, that's really disappointing. And these need to be addressed. So we need to do better in terms of managing modifiable risk factors for depression among midlife women transitioning through menopause. We can talk more about that as we go along. So hot flush management, again, just really reiterating that that's really important, and yet physicians don't feel confident to manage menopausal symptoms in their clinic. You can see as a stat there, from 2019 in the US, this is a Mayo Clinic study, I believe, where only 7% of trainee physicians felt adequately prepared to manage menopause in their clinics. So responding to kind of some of these issues and to support clinicians, I'm involved with the RANZCOG, Royal College of Obstetrician and Gynecology Guideline Development Group for Menopause Symptom Management. So it's sort of in that process of reviewing evidence and communicating the evidence of best practice treatment for menopausal symptoms to clinicians. And hot flushes can be treated. So depression really is the key outcome that I'd like to focus on, really because that's what we know the most about. In our review, we found far less evidence focused on anxiety, but of the evidence that does exist, there is some evidence that those with mild anxiety at baseline, so low anxiety at baseline, may be at risk of an increase in symptoms of anxiety over the menopause transition. But there's really a paucity of evidence and more work, which in part I'm involved with, is sort of responding to this deficit in knowledge. So bipolar disorder, again, there's not a lot of data, also not for schizophrenia or suicidality, but there is some data, as I've got here on the slides, that we can come back to. So sometimes, though, the media or clinical case studies might talk about these effects. So, of course, they can exist in terms of bipolar, but then also looking at that population-based evidence, I think is really important to understand what we know. remembering that when we don't have the high quality evidence behind us, we may not have the statistical power or the kind of clinical confidence or research confidence, really, to be able to communicate a real effect. And so this is why we need more of that high quality prospective data in this area. So again, there are media communications about suicide during the menopause transition, and absolutely that can perhaps be the case. But again, in terms of the evidence and global findings, we don't have that evidence yet that suicidality increases during the menopause transition, although there is a large Korean study that did find a small increase in suicidal ideation. So, there could be effects, but we want to kind of keep them in perspective of what the evidence said. So in that study, that increased from 5.7% to 7.2%. So a very real increase. So really, in a way, we're kind of saying that, yes, menopause impacts mental health, but a key message is that perhaps at times we've over-pathologized the menopause, and some of those ideas that menopause inevitably leads to catastrophic mental health, or any younger woman thinking about menopause, really they don't have to assume, oh, my mental health is going to go through the floor when I reach this transition. It's a balancing act, because we know that some women might experience declines in mental health, but it's not the norm and it's not inevitable. So there were heated discussions after publication of this paper last year. So Mary Claire Harver is sort of a big speaker in this space. She is a doctor, an author, very active on TikTok. And, they kind of said, well, this is really shocking to them. And they were really upset about our findings. And, talking about it being sort of out of touch with people's lived experience. So I think it's interesting to kind of, and we had some positive feedback as well, but it was a very heated feedback. And we can perhaps come back to this in the question time. But I remember I had a newborn, so I gave birth a few days after the paper was published, and I wrote a response to this kind of to this piece because, for example, she is talking about, we know there's the quadrupled risk of depression. I think she mentioned somewhere research has shown a fourfold increased risk, but that was the exact example that we did talk about in our Lancet paper, and said, well, yes, there's the fourfold or quadrupled risk, but when you look at the prevalence, you don't see this big skyrocketing. So we're trying to kind of be that more nuanced kind of interpretation of the data. So anyway, I wrote a rebuttal, but perhaps I was feeling a bit vulnerable with a little newborn. And then the editor that was kind of dealing with me, I realised that she was a close friend of this author. And so I felt a bit too scared to hold my ground, and I actually withdrew my rebuttal, because I just thought, well, look, if the editor is friends with her, the editor probably isn't going. Actually, that's right, they put in track changes to my piece. And I thought, oh, that seems a little bit biased, their track changes. And then I found out that. Anyway, this is a bit of a side story for a research seminar. But I think it's interesting context, because it shows that we, on the one hand, we really need that those conversations. We need energy and attention in the space, and we also want that kind of thoughtful research rigor alongside the public debate. So I feel like, given that we want to have time for questions, perhaps I'll just briefly talk about self-compassion. It's a bit of a shift gear, and then we can kind of move to question time. But again, I think I have to honour my heart. That's a bit more of the head stuff. And going back, this really goes back to what brought me to menopause in the first place, which was seeing midlife women and how much they have on their plates, and how often their focus is on other people's well-being, other people's happiness, having to put everybody's needs above their own, and not always having time to care for themselves. And so I've, from the very beginning of my research journey, been interested in the possibility of self-compassion as being sort of helpful in general, and especially for women around the time of menopause. So what is self-compassion? Self-compassion is about treating yourself with the same kindness that you might extend to a good friend, especially in times of need when you really need that care. Often, though, when we make a mistake, or if we're in a time of need, or if we feel like we haven't lived up to our high expectations that we set for ourselves, or maybe if we're sick and we have to kind of cancel work, and we feel, oh my gosh, why do I? And the inner critic can get going, and we can actually be quite hard on ourselves. Sometimes we can treat ourselves more like an enemy than a good friend. So self-compassion is about treating yourself with self-kindness, acknowledging that your own experience of suffering connects you to being human, common humanity, and also mindfulness, the capacity to be aware of your own experience of suffering without being over-identified with it and without being avoidant of it. So what about hot flushes, for example? I would never suggest that we just treat ourselves hot flushes with self-kindness and that they would somehow, go away, because a hot flush is a physiological experience and it can often be well treated with a medical option. But also alongside that, or, if we chose not to take a medication, but you can of course do both together, what about how we treat ourselves? If we're in a workplace that's not supportive of menopause and we are made to feel embarrassed, we might think, oh, this is so embarrassing. Why do I have to experience this? And oh my God, I better go away. So these kind of thoughts can actually worsen the impact of a hot flush. And that's not our fault. That's due to society. On the other hand, as we keep changing the dialogue about what hot flushes and what menopause mean, and also as we kind of use that friendly or more empowered dialogue with ourselves and treat ourselves with more kindness in the moment of a hot flush, does that help? So this is not experimental research, it's sort of more from survey data. But what we do know is that self-compassion does moderate or weaken the impact of hot flushes on our daily life functioning. So for any given number of hot flushes that you might have, so say you have a lot of hot flushes every day, say 10 per 24 hours, a woman with who scores very high on self-compassion, on average is likely to be less impacted by those symptoms, find them less interfering in daily life compared to somebody low on self-compassion. So it appears to be a relevant factor when it comes to managing hot flushes. We've done quite a lot of other work that we can perhaps come back to if there's specific questions around this. Also, I'm very interested in how self-compassion might be a gateway to feeling more positive and healthy about aging. It's actually quite hard to force somebody to feel good about aging. If you have workshops or if you try to talk about having a good attitude towards aging, it's not as powerful as subliminal primes, for example. You have to kind of get through the back door when it comes to cultivating healthy attitudes to aging sometimes. And so some of our work shows that self-compassion might be one of those indirect ways to feel a bit better about aging. So if your neck starts to droop, or, if you have self-compassion, you might be kinder in your inner dialogue and your emotional relationship toward yourself compared to if you had low self-compassion. That's just one micro example. But bearing in mind, self-compassion is a very sort of flexible skill that can be utilised for a particular issue, be it trivial or be it life-changing, like going through a divorce. So some of our work also shows that self-compassion can really be a foundation for various or the core aspects of healthy aging, potentially facilitating mental, physical well-being, social connectedness and engagement and activity. And people might say, oh, this is a panacea. You're just saying that this helps everything. We do know there's a very wide evidence sort of base for self-compassion as a psychological resilience factor. But at the same time, it's obviously not the be-all and end-all. So it can be utilised alongside other things. But I think it's a very useful framework. And we know that self-compassion becomes increasingly relevant to our well-being with age. When we're younger, perhaps we have a simpler life, less complexity, fewer relationships. When we're older, there are more challenges and opportunities to practice self-compassion. And so in this book chapter is where I sort of explored that, and how as we age, our self-compassion on average does deepen, but we also have this responsibility to use it to enhance our lives in the second half of our life, despite the inevitable challenges that come with age. All right. So I probably had too many slides, and I think I'd rather than hear the sound of my voice for too long, I think I'd rather end it there and save some time for questions. So I can perhaps, I'll stop my sharing. Is that how we go for questions? Or I stopped sharing? So, yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for a really thought-provoking presentation, and also for being so flexible and adaptive with it, and to sort of reflect the idea of let's give ourselves a bit of time for questions. I think that was really beautiful, and we do have some questions here. Before we kick off, I just want to remind everyone that if you unmute yourself and ask a question, you'll be included in the video version that will be uploaded onto the internet, just to make sure that you're fully aware of that. And do feel free to add some questions into the Q&A. We already have a few, or upvote some of the questions that are already there if you'd like to. I can see a hand up from Anita Go. I might invite Anita to unmute herself and show the video as well, if that's possible. We'll take that one question from the floor, and then we'll go over to the Q&A page that's already there and have a few questions that are written down. So do our people in the background, our NARI colleagues, have the ability to unmute Anita for us, please?
I am unmuted. Thank you.
You
Thank
are.
you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Lydia. That was super interesting. So my question is, I was looking through the participants of this seminar, and I know a lot of them, and really the sheer majority probably identify as women. So how do we get people, policymakers, researchers, clinicians, the general population, more interested in this sort of research of 50% of the population of the world, who are people's partners, mothers, sisters, holding up the care economy, holding up the general economy? So how do we kind of make this, I don't know, more interesting to the other half of the population?
Well, you know what? I feel like I've seen a huge shift in the past 3 or 4 years where menopause has been kind of ignored, to suddenly everybody is taking a great deal of interest. There's menopause committees being formed in workplaces. I would say it's actually a really exciting time to be a menopause researcher, and I would say that that's probably not where I see the problem to kind of be lying. I think, and well, this is just from where I see it, is that we're gaining this spotlight, and a challenge can be to balance the need to share information and ideas, but also with that kind of like shaky foundation of years of neglect. You can't compensate for years of neglect with a bit of a spotlight. And the risk can be that people might kind of too quickly kind of jump to communicate things without the evidence, and that can sometimes cause harm to women as well. So I don't have the answer of how we balance the kind of the patient, thoughtful building of research and engaging with, with these topics in that kind of research mindset, with the need to also have the kind of the attention here and now. But I do think we need to balance those two things.
Beautiful. Thanks, Lydia. I'll go now to the Q&A. We had a question, Amanda, I'm sorry that I didn't see this earlier. Amanda Burns asked, whether the presentation slide deck would be shared or whether they should take notes during. I will say that this video today, this presentation, will be uploaded onto the internet. Lydia, I'm not sure if you're able or willing to share the slide deck, or if there's another way in which people could engage if they haven't taken notes or they'd like some more details on some of the things you've shared today.
Yeah, they're very welcome to also reach out to me. And I had a slide at the end, but we're also running a one-day workshop. It is designed more for clinicians and especially psychologists. So we've got a neuropsychologist who's written a book on memory and aging and did her PhD in menopause and cognition. Dr. Anne Unkenstein and Professor Martha Hickey, a gynecologist who's really a world leader in menopause research, and myself. So we're running a PD day focused on menopause and mental health on October 30th. So that's also an opportunity to dive a little deeper into some of these topics.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I think, well, if anyone's interested in that, perhaps if they can contact Lydia directly, would that be okay? We've got your information available, so we'll get that working. That's wonderful. Francis, I can see your hand up, and thanks so much for that. I'll take a couple of the questions from the Q&A first, and then we'll come to you, absolutely. From Lavanya, I hope I've pronounced your name there correctly. She said that knowing the prevalence is not 68% is good news indeed, but isn't 28% still significant considering implications on mental health and quality of life for women that experience this? And Lydia, maybe you can speak to that.
What a great point, and I'm so pleased you raised that. It is absolutely significant, and we need to build mental health education programs and also look at sort of improving mental health for midlife women as they transition through menopause on multiple levels. And self-compassion is one tiny component of that, but we need social change. We need doctors to feel sort of informed and confident about treating women and looking at sort of options to manage symptoms and feel for them to be across all the best evidence around that, risks and benefits. So it's such a multi-tiered sort of issue, and it's a hugely important issue and neglected issue. So 28% is significant, and we need to focus on that. But I think it's a disservice to women if we kind of get stuck in the more, it's 68%, because then we don't know how to target our research, target our interventions to those who need it most. So having the kind of accurate data really enables us to focus our resources to where the issues lie and to address those.
Wonderful question and wonderful points. Thanks, Lydia. A question that's very much, in my area of interest around ADHD and autism here from Noreen. There's a lot of anecdotal information about the impact of perimenopause and menopause on autistic women with ADHD, autistic women with ADHD, often leading indeed to the diagnosis for previously undiagnosed women. And the information suggests that perimenopause and menopause increase impact of executive function issues, exacerbating mental health difficulties. And Noreen's wondering, is there any research to back this up? And if the research data on mental health for neurodivergent women, not just autism and ADHD, in perimenopause and menopause?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, such a great question. And I wish that we had been able to include ADHD and autism within our scope of our review, so I'd be able to give a clear answer about what the research says in that regard. But what I do know is that image I showed of sort of risk factors for menopause, for depressive symptoms at midlife, is this kind of compounding effect that you always see in the data. And I'd say it's sort of trans-diagnostic. Most of the research has been on depression, but they're kind of like a rope getting twisted together, and the two threads of the rope kind of reinforce each other. And I think that often happens. So if you have sort of mental health symptoms, or if you have sort of a developmental neurodivergent condition, it's when that is combined with menopausal symptoms, or you could have sort of brain fog or cognitive, then the two together, suddenly you could handle one or the other, but combined is where the issue lies. So I think that there's definitely a lot to that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Francis, if I could get you to unmute, please, and show your face if you're happy to. Would love to hear your question.
Thanks, Lydia. That was a great presentation. I'm wondering, and it comes back to the point you were making about the commentary you received after publishing the Lancet series. Why do you think this space is so polarized? I mean, you may not be able to answer it, but it seems like there's conflicting or polarized camps within this whole discourse about menopause. Do you have an opinion on that?
That's a good question. I remember having to debrief with my clinical supervisors as psychologists. We often, we speak with clinical psychologists, supervisors, and I was sort of saying, oh, I feel so kind of attacked from this. And maybe also my hormonal changes of being in early parenthood at the time. And he said that when an area has been neglected, the first wave advocates tend to have kind of like an angriness or an intensity to it. And then it's the second wave that can sort of be a bit more like nuanced and thoughtful. But sometimes I think if something's been so neglected, you need that kind of force, or maybe that kind of polarized kind of feeling of some people yes, some people no. And it's just a sign or a symptom of something that's been neglected coming into the light. And then with time, then some of that polarizing can sort of start to kind of integrate as we go along. That's what he told me, and it helped me.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions and comments here from Julia Todd, and I'm just going to sort of combine those in. Julia's saying that her own GP advised against HRT, as she felt that it would only postpone the symptoms she was experiencing. And Julia felt she was instead expected to weigh up how much of an impact her symptoms were having on her daily life. And she'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that, and just really noting as well how managers might need to be more aware and trained in these sort of areas, given the significant impacts of work capacity of the menopause transition. If you've got some points there, Lydia.
Yeah, I mean, MHT is a very effective treatment for hot flashes, and we know that. So if you take MHT, it can, and you have significant symptoms, they can reduce. We also know that when you do stop taking menopausal hormone therapy, you can sort of see those symptoms return or potentially worsen. And so, I was speaking to somebody about this yesterday, that yes, you can see that kind of rebound afterwards, but also on average, hot flushes don't tend to last your whole sort of older adulthood. And so if you take it during that window when your hormones are going through the hormonal changes of menopause, there can be benefit there. So I also I'm not a medical doctor, I don't prescribe menopausal hormone therapy, but I'm very interested and am across the research around it. And so, yeah, look, I don't have one answer for it, but hopefully that answers the question in some way. Was there one second part to the question?
That was really just more about the should managers be receiving, psychoeducation or further education in this space?
I think, and this is just, I commonly hear that people talk about being not just distracted, but sometimes embarrassed or impacted about menopause or feeling unable to talk about it at work. And I would say that's absolutely unacceptable. And so I think a key part of where the social change needs to happen is through workplaces. Yeah. And I know that's happening, and the companies are starting to talk more about this, and I think that's great. And really key area that we'll see growth in, I hope and think, in the years ahead.
Debbie has made a similar sort of point here, just a comment, not being ashamed is so very helpful to mental health, and really does make me think, this is my little addition here, Lydia, around your self-compassion work that you've been talking about. But Debbie's worked in an age demographic where a few of us have had flushes now and then. I have a beautiful handheld fan she pulls out, she says, which is admired by others. And she shares her lavender spray, and we laugh about it together. And she feels lucky that she can do this in her environment, and hopefully a positive one for younger people. She never understood it early on, so the more that she's talked about it, it's had such a positive effect. And I can actually reflect myself, remembering when I started my career, I was in an office shared with a few women going through menopause who would laugh about having the air conditioner up and freezing the rest of us, and how powerful and helpful that was for me as I'm heading into that sort of time in my own life. And so I echo what Debbie said there. I'm just looking to make sure we're about to finish up. Narissa has just, pointed out what a fantastic presentation that you've had, Lydia. And I think that's actually a great point for us to end on, because I echo that and really appreciate Lydia's time. Please join me in thanking Lydia. You might want to, share the applause, as I can see a few colleagues doing. As we're pulling towards a close, I would just say that our next presentation will be in a month's time from Jake McMahon. He's a PhD candidate and NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in wiser wound care and clinical fellow of the ACU, and he'll be presenting his research on pressure injuries. So encourage you to attend that one as well. Thanks again, Lydia, and thanks everyone for their attendance today. We'll call the meeting to a close.